Yeah, so if people want to chat further, about stuff, feel free.
Evan, did you have more to the?
Oh, I don't know. I was just rambling. I don't know. I mean,
I just say that what the Rivette Sun Rohmer Moon.
Yeah. I was talking to Nathan yesterday. Again, these are just my ramblings. I don't know if this is of interest to anyone, but like I feel like I was sort of thinking about these filmmakers who are in the Rohmerian tradition, but I tend to plot in my mind a lot of the filmmakers who are, I think, very influenced by the new wave along a kind of cosmology of like Rivette as the moon and Rohmer as the sun. And I think there's a lot of filmmakers who are, I think Hong is someone who I think of as, he bears the like practical elements of Rohmer, but is actually much more of like this lunar kind of filmmaker, much closer in my little personal cosmology, I think, to Rivette actually. But
yeah, there's a kind of a humor in Hong that I find grounding, even though the films don't seem grounded, but there's this humor that makes them very everyday. And whereas Rivette really flies off into a metaphysical world to me.
Yeah, see, I've never quite found Rivette as metaphysical as that. Like
I find him more concrete than
I do. Yeah, I mean, and I can get why people don't, but like when Film Society did that program, whatever, of like Lynch and Rivette a number of years ago, I found that just totally puzzling to me because I don't see like anything like that, that kind of mysticism or whatever you want to call it in Rivette nearly to the same extent that I see it in Lynch. Man, I rewatched Up, Down, Fragile recently, which is a film that is totally grounded in the particulars of just like walking around Paris, and the mysteries of that or the way that the mysteries emerge in that film, I think for me are very similar to the way that Hong creates like mysteries in his films, and I don't quite find
I don't find Rivette mystical so much as I find him attached to a kind of a sense of fancy, a sense, using narrative for this kind of sense of the insolite, of the kind of what can't be easily told. And I think Hong has a kind of a humor which deflates that and brings it back to this very everyday.
You're unmuted, so.
I just want to say goodbye.
Bye! Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. So long. Bye. Yeah, I think that like I was watching Pauline right now, and I had sort of Evan's formulation in mind, and these thoughts are very unformed also, but like it's sort of I think that there is a sort of, I think I maybe see it more clearly in something like the Marquise of O or La Collection News, like this sort of, there's sort of like a out of the ordinary, out of these like very ordinary interactions, there's something mysterious about them to me. Like they have their own mystery, like, but it's a different sense of mystery than someone like Rivette. Like just to throw that out there, I sort of jumped into that without fully formulating the thought. But
no, I guess I could understand that.
Yeah, just like something in just like how casual they are, and yet how they build up to this sort of impossible to describe, impossible to really quantify their impacts. Like they have, like Rohmer films have an impact on me that's very different from Rivette films, like where the mystery is like sort of inherent in the Rivette films, but they're not in the Rohmer films, and yet they nevertheless get at a sort of mysterious place just because of how, like, and I guess it's maybe similar to Hawks or something like that, where it rises out of it like at a moment's notice.
Rohmer is like, I mean, this is just, I don't mean to impose this, but I feel like he is always serving something. I feel like there's some lack of ego there, where he does not want to, he wants to see himself as serving reality, as serving a kind of a classicism. And that to me is like, has a kind of a, the poetry all comes from that, I think. Whereas Rivette, I feel as if he's moving into some other realm with his use of narrative. So it feels a touch different to me. I never felt a strong connection between the two of them somehow.
Yeah, I mean, personally, speaking of the difference between the two, is that
this is obviously an oversimplification because there are movies like The Green Ray, but for the most part, like Rivette kind of starts with the mystery. That's always text almost, you know. If it isn't text, it is at least the main preoccupation, it feels like. Whereas Rohmer, it's kind of like, you know, it's him kneading dough and kneading dough and kneading dough, and then that pops out. And rather than starting at the sort of sense of mystery, that is a byproduct of everything else that happens.
Yeah, I feel like there's
It's
something.
interesting to.
Okay.
I was gonna say it's interesting to talk that we're talking about Rivette and Rohmer as these two kind of poles, and that I think usually if we're talking about the French New Wave, we're talking about Truffaut and Godard as the kind of like common like poles of, you know, one side of the New Wave versus the other side of the New Wave. But in terms of Cahiers, it was Rohmer versus Rivette, and it was
I mean,
you were either on Rivette's side. I mean, obviously they were both kind of operating within this politique d'auteur framework, but Rohmer kind of would generally be associated with a more kind of traditionalist, you know, classical, everything is a lineage, whereas Rivette was kind of like the more radical side of it.
You headed that whole move to drive Rohmer out of the editorship.
Yep.
Yeah.
And it was kind of noted in the autobiography, Rohmer was like amazingly never seemed to hold the slightest have any grudge or.
Well, I mean, he is obviously an out one, not that much longer after that, you know.
Yeah, there was like a continuing, an ongoing. I mean, even Truffaut, who loved Rohmer, I think was maybe on the other side of that one. And as far as anybody could tell, Rohmer was not that kind of person that held grudges or had a vengeful quality to him.
Well, I kind of get the sense too that it maybe freed Rohmer from something that he was still continuing to kind of shepherd, but was not that interested in anymore at that point. Like, I mean, you know, I was reading this interview with that Jean-Claude Biet did with Rohmer. I don't know if I can find it off the top of it, but he basically says like we weren't critics. We were, you know, filmmakers who just did some film criticism for a while, you know, and I would not be surprised if part of his not holding a grudge there was that he was just kind of ready to move on from that world anyways. And
some people hold grudges anyway. I think.
Well, true. I mean,
I have a little trouble, you know, it sounds like it was really a kind of a putsch. I might have a little trouble putting it behind me so easily.
It's interesting. I was reading Rohmer on Rebel Without a Cause last night, which is it's interesting because I mean it's one of my favorite filmmakers writing about one of my favorite films, and I don't quite see it. I don't quite see that film the same way that he does, but it was interesting in that it felt so clearly like he was kind of working through certain ideas, like through Nicholas Ray, that he would then kind of end up expressing his own work. I can look for this somewhere in here.
Kind of hard not to do that.
Oh yeah, do you have is it the 50s one? This is the 60s one.
I was looking at. Yeah. I have the 60s one. I borrowed the 60s one from Jason.
All right, everyone.
Yeah, you're welcome. I was gonna say you're welcome. Credit me.
If you don't have a Kaye collection, please leave right now. Hold it up as proof. No.
Yeah, I did get the Rohmer biography. I do have that.
Oh yes, Sean. Yeah. Oh, I've got a whole Rohmer shelf. I've got the coffret. I've got the bio. There's this. You know, it's.
You guys have this?
I have a paper copy of that.
I have a PDF of that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Old library copy of that. Yeah.
Very valuable.
Yeah.
Have you read the whole?
What is it? I'm sorry, it didn't cut to you.
It's the taste for beauty.
Oh yeah. Keith showed his earlier.
Oh, did he?
In a different hangout, he showed his.
Have you read all of it, Dan, or most of it?
Yeah.
Or?
Oh, I haven't read it in a little while. I read it, yes, from cover to cover.
I found it very hard to get into. As much as I love Rohmer, I found that particular collection almost impenetrable to me.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I haven't tried it in a while, so I think I might go back and give it another shot. Even just going over Celluloid and Marble last night, I was getting way more out of it now than I have a year or two ago. But yeah, I'm just wondering if that was a thing other people had encountered, because I wasn't sure if the translation was the issue or if it was Rohmer's writing itself.
I really liked it when I read it. I really sucked it in.
I mean, for me, I kind of had the same experience you did, Nathan. Like, I've had that paper copy sitting around forever, and I've never read the whole thing, partly because it is kind of challenging. But then, I mean, like, reading this interview, and then I went back this morning and read some more from The Taste for Beauty, and, like, this interview was very helpful in clarifying what he's talking about, because he's having to sort of rephrase everything in more concrete terms in this interview, that a lot of the stuff he's talking about in those pieces. So I might go back and read it again now that I've got some of his other framings of those same ideas in mind.
This is the 60s interview with the slightly hostile Cahiers audience?
No, this is an interview with Jean-Claude Biet. It's very, very not hostile. I think Biet is a very clear case of a Rohmerian figure. But
Biet's figuring in my life in another way now, because John Doerr, the Easy TV filmmaker that helped me make this movie, is now experiencing a kind of a surge of interest in France, and Biet was the first one.
Yes, I knew that. Yeah, I did know that, actually, that Biet had supported his films.
Yeah.
I didn't know you had a connection with John Doerr, though.
He helped me make my first movie. He completely was responsible for me making my first movie. He just gave me the use of all his equipment in his studio for nothing. Absolutely for nothing. I wound up signing over my tax check rebate to him when it came, but that's the only money he got out of me, really. And he acted like I was doing him a favor. Very nice guy.
Huh. Have you seen any of the... Oh, go ahead, Eitan.
I was going to say I found that the section from the Rebel review that I was thinking of. He's talking about... he's comparing him to various other filmmakers that he doesn't like as much, John Huston and Mankiewicz. And he says his tempo, this is about Ray, his tempo is slow, his melody usually monochord, but its delineation is so precise, its progress so compulsive, that we cannot allow our attention to stray for a moment. The bravura set pieces, brilliant as they are, only assume prominence after a slow crescendo. It is more an art of connections than of brilliancies, which I feel like is a poor description of Nicholas Ray to me, and especially of Rebel Without a Cause, because the first 20 minutes of that movie are so intense. But it feels like a perfect description of Rohmer's movies. Interesting. Anyway.
It's hard to recapture these things in a way. He's saying that there's something not flowing about Ray, and I understand what he means, I think, because somehow there's something about Ray that kind of rips the fabric just a little bit of the smooth melodramatic structures. I'd have to ponder the whole thing a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to throw out a question. This was in the prepared questions because I'm just curious to hear what people say. What do you think is the most overrated Rohmer film?
Not a framework I'm in the habit of using.
I feel like I can't answer that question.
Okay, actually, in that case, then maybe because the flip side is which is the most underrated, and I'm using those terms instead of favorite or good or bad or whatever, because I think they're all good. I think we all agree, but it's more like which ones deserve more attention that maybe they don't get.
Romance of Estrella and Celadon for me. I find that one not being seen as this sort of minor, floating off into the distance, it's his final film, as puzzling as I think that is about as good as his films come, which is, I love him, so it's not a minor recommendation, but I do find that one's, I don't know, relative obscurity puzzling, but I don't know.
It's I always think that Rohmer tries to make these films to bring himself closer to the subject, to the material. And the material in that one is more challenging maybe for more people like me and others. I think it's just it's a more remote kind of difficult time to inhabit, but Rohmer doesn't care. He just is going to inhabit it, and he's better at inhabiting those periods. He lived them more. It's a bigger part of his life. So I think the distance between Rohmer and his audience might be greater in the case of an old work like that, which requires a certain amount of will and desire to enter into the world of. But I think he always was like that with all his material. Might be easier sometimes than others, but I just think he's always serving something, and I think he's serving that material.
I completely agree. I said I completely agree.
Yeah, but it's understandable that a 7th century source or whatever it is, what is it? 16th century adaptation of what?
Well, I think it's a 16th or like somewhere around there, 15th, 16th century text that is set in the 7th century. And so it's like you've got these multiple layers of like, was that 5th century?
5th century.
5th century, yeah, okay. It's got those like multiple layers of sort of perspective happening, which is actually one of the things that I find quite fascinating about that movie is, at all times, Rohmer is like negotiating like the present perspective on the 16th century or whatever it was, and then the 5th century, kind of all those things filtered together.
But he has no sense of like feeling fazed by that. He wants to enter into those worlds, and he wants to try to render them at what's due them. It's a little harder for those of us who aren't as scholarly, aren't as adept as him, maybe. But
I feel the same way in what you're talking about as I do with Ho Xiao Shen sometimes. And that sometimes some of his specific reference points, some of his specific settings, obviously something like Flowers of Shanghai, are sometimes the barrier to try and meet where the movie's at on a perspective level is going to be a lot harder than something like Dust in the Wind, or you choose any other Ho Xiao Shen movie like Millennium Mambo, where the barrier to try and meet the perspective is a lot higher due to various things like that refraction of a history being seen in 2006.
I feel like the mission of a historian is like almost this thing you approach asymptotically, like you try to erase by whatever means you can and whatever scholarship you can, you try to erase the barriers between you and another time so that you can understand them. And I think Rohmer saw that as an intellectual obligation for him. And some of us maybe just haven't put the work in or haven't got the right temperament for it. All of us.
This leads nicely into Marquise of O, which I would struggle to call that underrated just because I know so many people, at least in this discussion, hold that in pretty high regard. I certainly underrated it. The first time I watched it, I struggled with it. I couldn't really figure out what it was doing. And the second time I watched it, was a real revelatory experience.
That one feels very full-bodied in a way. It gets to a certain point in history that we can relate to almost as melodrama, almost. I'm not saying it right.
I feel
I see what you're saying.
I feel similarly with, again, it's funny how the historical films come up in this way fairly frequently, either the post-2000 ones or the 70s ones, because I feel, Percival is definitely in my top 2 or 3. Rohmer, usually it's at the top. And I sometimes feel like because it is such a faithful medieval work that it poses a barrier to people, even to like Rohmer fans who maybe people who come to him because they love the conversational aspect, and Percival doesn't have that. It's all just like this liturgical text almost, or it's dramaturgical, but it has that liturgical flavor to it. And I just find like, I forget who it was who I was reading who said this, but it just opened the film up so much more for me when I read it, when they described Percival as the natural endpoint of Rohmer's Bazinian discipleship, in that he's not going to create the illusion of a medieval world that doesn't exist now because we're in modern times. He's so faithful to realism that he is only going to stage a medieval text in the way that medievals would have staged it, which means the closed setting, the very fanciful soundstage. Like, I don't know, to me, it's just to think of that as the ultimate expression of this sort of devotion to realism is
along those lines, The Lady and the Duke, where he is perfectly happy staging the action in front of these like sketches.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. If I was going to answer my question about underrated, though, I would say for me it's Rendezvous in Paris. Is one of those works that I just come back to again and again privately, and I hardly ever see people talking about it. And I don't know if it's because it's the anthology aspect or if it's I think that they're three basically perfect short films, and then all together they kind of work in this independent way. But then I also have a weakness for that kind of structure. Ho Xiaoshen came up earlier 3 times. Mm-hmm. I would never say, like, someone was like, what's your favorite Ho Xiaoshen film? I wouldn't say 3 times. I'd probably say something else. But 3 times is the one I think about the most, by far, all the time. Like every week, every few days, like 3 times comes up. And it has to do with that structure, those 3 kind of, I know that one's more linked together, but that and Rendezvous to Paris are like, I don't know, there's something about those discrete parts in their own perfection working together that I wish, I want to experience more of.
Anthology poses problems for people. Almost always people's reactions are, I like parts 1 a lot. Mm-hmm. Part 2 is a little funny. You know, it's interesting. It's a different kind of, it runs into this barrier we have against trying to unify the work.
Oddly enough, though, one of the movies in which I think people have the least hard time doing that is actually Four Adventures of Mirabelle and Renette. And that is consistently seen as like almost not an anthology movie, where it is like fundamentally it is exactly what the title says, and yet there is such a strong emotional connection between the 4 stories that even though it still has the same 2 main protagonists, more or less I don't remember them feeding into each other in any way, shape, or form.
I think though you get the narrative development there is their like changing relationship and their like friendship deepening over the course of the
strong characters. The one character in particular who's very, very strong, and so the film could be seen as an elaborating of the characterizations. So it's an anthology, but it does have this kind of hook, this kind of thread through it all. Renette is so bizarre in a lot of ways. You can just like keep doing that thing with her over and over again. I think Triple Agent is, I think, a film that keeps going up for me every time I see it.
Yeah, that's the film of Rohmer's that I just can't. Like, I've never been able to really find a way into that one, but really the only one.
I love Triple Agent.
So I rewatched Triple Agent and actually did a podcast with Ryan about it. And the thing that
I liked it more than he did.
Yeah, the thing that was most interesting to me about Triple Agent, actually, though, that did make it a somewhat richer experience after having not really liked it at all the first time I watched it, was having read the biography and talking again about the kind of way that he segregated his like family life from his work life. And watching Triple Agent again, it sort of dawned on me that it's maybe the film of Rohmer's that's most about that own experience that he had. Like basically, he's a man with an alias, like he does his job, with this alias, and the whole movie is basically from the wife's perspective about her husband who's constantly leaving and going to do this work that she doesn't really have a perspective on. And I found that quite interesting because I don't really think Rohmer's someone for whom I find like a whole lot of autobiography in the films, like in a direct kind of way. But Triple Agent was, after reading the biography, was one that suddenly seemed more personal than I guess I had maybe realized.
I was reading Nabokov at one point. I think it was Pale Fire. I'm trying to remember which one I was reading. And there comes the story of Triple Agent, the real life story. And Nabokov also devotes this long section to it and tells the whole story. So it's like a story that's been out there. Whether it's autobiographical, I don't know. I'm not sure. But
I don't know. Yeah, no, I don't know that. I mean, I don't think that Rohmer necessarily would choose it that way. But I think to me, it's revealing in a sense that his interest lands here, I don't think he would have conceived it that way.
The perspective that you mentioned is kind of amazing in that film, though. The fact that this guy is other, narratively speaking, this guy is other, and that's not underscored.
Mm-hmm.
But it really is very strong in the telling of the story that he is other. We don't know what's
exactly.
going on.
Yeah, right.
Not the way people usually tell that story about somebody who's a mystery.
Mm-hmm.
It's got a very unassuming surface in that regard. It does not type him obviously in that regard. Anyway, I like that.
We're gonna see a stampede on Letterboxd, Triple Agent showing up in the recent likes by friends, right? Let's make it happen. Actually, I haven't seen Triple Agent. That and Astray are the two I haven't seen. I've been kind of putting them off.
Well, you want to save a little bit of Rohmer's career?
I think so, but I this year I'm going to
live with it. Your relationship with the film begins when you see it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Maybe it's time for me to get going here too. I actually have to write an article for Vancouver.
For Josh.
Vancouver, we own you this weekend. Yeah. Cool. Well, Dan, thank you so much for facilitating so much and just everything and for putting.
I hope I didn't open my mouth too much. I found myself just kind of like talking.
No, it's great.
It's fantastic. It was great. Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah. No, thank you, and thank you for bringing them and Mary in touch with us.
That was so funny. I hope that she enjoyed it. She's so enigmatic. It's so hard to tell. She's like.
She seemed to be having fun. I mean, she's pulling out the color-coded scripts and putting on the hat. I mean.
Sometimes I thought she was bored. Sometimes I thought we were taking it in directions she didn't like. But I think it was just her her way she presents.
I think it was still a surprise, even reading so much about Rohmer over the years and how much he drew from his collaborators to make the films. I think I was still surprised to see how much she resembled one of the characters.
Totally, yeah.
I wasn't expecting that.
Well, I mean, he tends to cast people over and over with certain personality traits, and I think he just really goes into the person very deeply. And then sometimes it's not even that flattering for some people to see what comes out, but there it is. He doesn't like switch them around. He wouldn't give like Beatrice Roman the Vivier role or vice versa. Okay,
all right.
I'm going for this leave meeting button.
All right. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Stay safe.
Well, I'm starving, so I'm probably also going
I have to go to
eat something.
So Lee leaves, and then everybody's suddenly like, "Oh, I gotta go!" Oh.
I've been dreaming about eating some toast for the last hour. So
it's that, or I read the rest of the paper I didn't get to read. So if I start reading, maybe everyone will like flee for the exits. So.
We're still recording. You can do it just as a denouement.
We could, but it's not even like finished.
Or you can share it as well.
It's like, you know what I can do? I never finished writing it, so maybe what I'll do is I'll finish writing it and just share that as a blog post or something. So
yeah,
okay,
do it.
Yeah.
That'd be great.
Accountability. All right. Well, guys, thank you everyone who's still here, including those of you who are I can't see you, but thank you for making this a great time. So yeah, let's do it again sometime.
Nathan.
Yeah, absolutely.
This was great. Thank you for arranging it, Nathan.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nathan.
Just
this
so
is
long.
Wonderful.
So long for the ride. So.
Okay.
All right, guys. Stay safe.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Stay safe. Goodbye.